For the n-Lorem Foundation, N of 1 doesn't mean alone because every patient matters. Hope for nano-rare patients and their families has never been more within reach. Visit n-Lorem.org today to donate and make hope possible. Can you believe it's been 2 years since we started this podcast journey together? We want to hear from you on how to make the Patient Empowerment Program podcast series an even better resource for nano-rare patients. Please consider giving us a few minutes of your time to complete a survey on our podcast. As a thank you, you'll receive a special coupon code to the official n-Lorem Foundation store. You can access this survey by using the link in the description. Your feedback means a lot to us.
Hello and welcome to the n-Lorem podcast series, a series that focuses exclusively on patients now referred to as having nano-rare mutations. I'm Stan Crook, and I'm the founder, chairman, and CEO of n-Lorem. n-Lorem is a nonprofit foundation that I initiated in January of 2020. Our mission at n-Lorem is to take advantage of the technology we created at Ionis Pharmaceuticals, Antisense technology, or ASO technology, to discover, develop, and provide experimental ASO treatments to nano-rare patients, and to do that for free for life. Many of our patients have nano-rare mutations that cause severe central nervous system diseases. And as you know, for CNS diseases, we dose intrathecally, which is usually abbreviated IT. And we do that about every 3 months or so. Intrathecal administration is a route of administrations for ASOs and other drugs via an injection directly into the spinal fluid, which resides in the spinal canal. That's what we'll be talking today about. And in fact, today, what I want to discuss is why we choose to dose IT for CNS diseases. But to do that, let me begin with a very simple view of the human body and the major barriers that protect us from our environment. So the simplest way to think of the human body is that it's comprised of 4 tubes that allow us to acquire the materials we need to live and to support the various organs that allow us to function and to live. And all of this is enclosed in a barrier we call the skin. I dare say that if you were asked to build a human, you would likely come up with the same basic design. So the 4 tubes then. Well, the first tube is the enteral tube. As I said, the human body is divided into multiple tubes, but into 2 large units that are either referred to as enteral or parenteral. Parenteral means next to or adjacent to, but obviously different from enteral. Enteral, simply put, means passing through the intestines. The enteral system begins with the mouth and ends with the anus. Its job is to support the acquisition of solid nutrients and eliminate solid waste. The gut is actually very complex, but the design is beautifully simple. To accept solid nutrients, the gut must be exposed to the external environment. That's risky. The external environment has a lot of material that you might put in your mouth that is actually quite dangerous and toxic for you. Moreover, there are billions and billions of infectious agents that you ingest every time you swallow. Think of how many times a day you swallow. So the gut has to have a barrier that can select the good stuff that we need and allow that to enter while preventing the bad stuff from accessing our internal organs. And indeed it does. The second tube is the respiratory tube. And once again, the respiratory tube, which begins with the mouth and ends with the alveoli cells in the lung that exchange oxygen for carbon dioxide on hemoglobin in blood as it flows through the pulmonary arterioles. Once again, that whole system is exposed to the environment. The lung and the rest of the respiratory system must have barriers that prevent access of toxins, and especially viruses and bacteria, from the rest of the body. And also, there are significant barriers that prevent infectious organisms from getting into the lung. The third tube is the urinary tube. And you can think of the renal arteries, the kidneys, the bladder, and the urethra as a tube designed to get rid of water-soluble waste. Since the urethra is exposed to the external environment, the kidneys must be protected from infectious organisms that are ever present. And to do that, then, the kidneys funnel urine into a holding unit, the bladder. Of course, the bladder is why you don't have to excrete urine constantly, but even more importantly, it protects against infectious organisms getting into the kidneys and beyond. It does that by having a unique type of lining. In fact, almost all the time somebody tells you he's got a kidney infection, they usually mean they have a bladder infection. A kidney infection is a much more serious infection than is a urethra or bladder infection. And then the final tube is the CNS tube. Now, as you know, the brain and spinal cord are certainly not exposed to the external environment, but the brain and spinal cord are literally the nerve center of the body. And they are protected by bone. Your skull and all your ribs and skeletal features are really principally designed to protect your brain, and they are also protected from blood. The facts are you simply cannot risk exposure of your CNS to toxins and infectious organisms. And so it is doubly protected. It's inside the body, and even then, it has a barrier that protects it from easy access of systemic blood. And that is called the blood-brain barrier. And that is the focus of our conversation today. So, key point. To protect us from our environment, but support acquisition of nutrients and elimination of waste, the body has tubes that interact with the environment, but protect internal organs. A second key point. The CNS has an extra level of protection that separates the CNS from the systemic circulation, and that is called a blood-brain barrier. Why don't we talk about barriers and how the body constructs barriers? The body is comprised of cells, and there's a dizzying array of types of cells that have different specialized functions and are capable of making all the materials that comprise your body. Everything that you are starts as a cell. And if you stop and think about that for a moment, it's really just amazing. You start as a single cell that has all the capability to make everything else that you are. And then that differentiates into this astonishing array of specialist cells that make you who you are, make all the materials that you need to be who you are. And that ranges from the brain to the bone, and every substance from DNA to mucus. It follows then that any barrier in the body must be made up of cells and the things that they can make. So there must be similarities between barriers and other compartments of the body, and also different barriers in the body. Almost certainly have to share many characteristics. The cell type responsible for most barriers in the body is the epithelial cells. Yeah, that's the same type of cell that makes up your skin. To make a barrier, cells must stick together. And so they construct material that serves like mortar between bricks in a house. The body can vary how tight those junctions between cells are by varying how tightly the cells stick together, and by varying the content and the amount of the intracellular mortar, that is the material between cells that you can think of as the mortar that's in between your bricks in your house or whatever. Just like most houses have insulation, when barriers are constructed in the body, they attach to insulation, and the insulation is called a basement membrane. Interesting that it's called a basement, isn't it? The basement membrane serves as both a foundation for the barrier and insulation. In addition, for added protections, cells can secrete a variety of things, but among others, mucus. Mucus is used to trap larger particles and larger molecules. So a thing like a virus or a bacterium or asbestos that you breathe in, almost all of that is trapped in mucus. And there are cells that have tiny little leg things that are called cilia, whose job it is to fight against gravity and move all of those things that you need protection from upwards and out of the respiratory tract so that you can just exhale. There are similar types of mucus in other places in the body. So each barrier may differ a little in composition and the types of secretions that it may produce, but they are going to be similar. For example, the skin is clearly the largest organ in the body. People tend to forget that. And it is the most solid of all the barriers. Your skin secretes sweat and sebum, among other things. And sebum is an oily substance that both helps the skin stay moist and also protects it. Key point, the body uses specialized cells and materials secreted by cells to form bricks and mortar type structures that serve as barriers. Let's talk about cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid is typically abbreviated CSF. You'll hear that term frequently. Like all organs, the central nervous system must receive nutrients and eliminate waste. But unlike other organs, the CNS does not interact directly with systemic blood. Rather, the CNS interacts with cerebrospinal fluid. CSF is produced by a vascular organ in the brain called the choroid plexus. CSF is distributed to all parts of the CNS via the central canal of the spinal cord, another tube. You can think of the central canal as a low-pressure artery like the pulmonary artery. It can be unmeasurable to 5 to 10 millimeters of mercury. Very, very different from your systemic circulation, which has, if you're normal, a systemic blood pressure of, say, 140 millimeters of mercury. Adults have about 150 mils or cc's of CSF. And that CSF that's in there has very little protein, typically no, but certainly very few cells. It does have electrolytes, that is charged materials like sodium, potassium, chloride, and the like, glucose, and other small molecules, including a host of neurotransmitters. CSF circulates from the choroid plexus to the brain, down the spinal column, and back up to the brain again. In the brain, there are spaces that create lakes of CSF. Those are called ventricles. And since CSF is in a closed space, any increase in CSF production or reduction in clearance will lead to an increase in CSF and requires then some sort of response. You can get an increase in CSF production because of problems with the choroid plexus. You can have stuff accumulate at the little exit points for CSF and block exit. And you can also see a significant increase in CSF if there's an inflammatory process, such as you might see with an infection in the central nervous system. If there is an increase in CSF volume and it's rapid, the only choice is that CSF pressure increases, and that's called high pressure hydrocephalus. If the CSF builds slowly, the pressure may be dissipated because the ventricles expand to accommodate that extra fluid. But of course, that's not so good for you because it compresses the brain and gives you smaller space for your brain. That is called low pressure hydrocephalus. High pressure hydrocephalus, low pressure hydrocephalus. They are exactly the same thing, just different timescales. CSF then is basically a filtrate of blood that contains little to no protein or cells, but does contain a lot of stuff that the brain needs, including glucose, all the key ions, small molecule neurotransmitters, and lots of other stuff. The central nervous system is protected from systemic blood and uses its own produced material, CSF, to do all the things that blood does for the rest of the body. And that CSF is a very significant filtrate of blood. If you think about all the cells and proteins and everything else you have in blood, to pass that through and end up with just something that's very clear and very tidy, actually, really must be a very important thing to protect the brain, and it is. Now, the membranes that line the central nervous system are called dura, and there are 3 different layers of membranes. Capillaries that provide blood to be converted to CSF, of course, have to interact with the CNS, and those sites of interaction are called neurovascular junctions. Nerve interactions with the central nervous systems of arterioles, blood vessels. At those sites, interactions between endothelial cells, the lining of the blood vessel, or the capillaries, and CNS cells take place. The lining of capillaries is made up, as I said, of endothelial cells, and by design, capillaries have little pores, and the Latin name for window is fenestra. Fenestra means window or small opening. So in normal capillary beds, of course, you're trying to pass blood that has oxygen and nutrients into the tissue and collect blood that has depleted oxygen, added CO2, and waste back into the veins. And so the capillaries and veins have a lot of these little pores. That's the rest of the body. But to prevent cerebral capillaries from leaking into CNS tissues, the blood-brain barrier is formed. You have a blood-brain barrier to protect your brain and spinal cord, even from your own blood. It's formed, that is the blood-brain barrier, by several layers of bricks and mortar arrangements of special cells and cellular secretions, just like all the other barriers, beginning with endothelial cells that line the cerebral arterioles. These endothelial cells are quite different, really, from the endothelial cells that line all the other capillaries in your vascular beds in the body. They also express different kinds of proteins and make slightly different kinds of materials. And many of those proteins that are expressed uniquely on the endothelial cells in cerebral arterioles are used like pegs or screws to connect the endothelial cells much more tightly when they're in the CNS or feeding the CNS than in the periphery. And those junctions, simply enough, are called tight junctions. Those endothelial cells with tight junctions share the basement membrane with another type of vascular cell called pericytes. Pericytes express proteins that actually connect the cells that line the capillary bed with the pericytes themselves and the surrounding CNS tissue. And that then forms an even more effective barrier than simply tight junctions in the capillary bed. If you can think about that as one unit, and then that unit is basically wrapped in CNS cells called astrocytes that have extensions that look like, again, little feet, and form these very stable connections now between the CNS cells and the cerebral capillaries. Bricks and mortar, then lots of insulation. It's now a real barrier that actively decides what gets into your brain and what stays out. The brain is important. The spinal cord is an extension of the brain. You even protect all of that from your own blood through having this unique barrier called the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier, then, key point, is constructed cooperatively by cerebral capillaries, which are endothelial cells, pericytes, and then the CNS cells, such as astrocytes. Of course, the 2 organs must collaborate. Another key point, the blood-brain barrier contains tight junctions and layers of cells that serve as added elements of the blood-brain barrier. If there's this barrier, what kind of molecules are admitted, and what are the ones that are excluded from the CNS? Well, Simplistically, the blood-brain barrier actually takes up glucose, which is the major source of energy for the brain. And that's why you can use glucose PET scans to, assess what parts of the brain are actually functioning. It also contains all the electrolytes that you need. These are ions, and many, many other components that the brain needs, including all these neurotransmitters that are, the communication devices. Small fat-soluble or lipid-soluble molecules can pass through the blood-brain barrier passively. So some drugs, like some barbiturates and steroids and so on, are very lipophilic or soluble in fat. They ignore the blood-brain barrier and they get right in and produce the pharmacology they produce. But almost all other drugs are excluded. And not just other drugs, but most everything else. So any molecule that is charged, like an antisense drug, an ASO, that is water-soluble, like ASOs, and is not tiny, like ASOs, has to be excluded by the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier excludes lots of things. It very specifically excludes a lot of different proteins, DNA, RNA, and it excludes cells like bacteria. So that presents a real therapeutic challenge for using ASOs for the central nervous system. And we solved that years ago by avoiding the blood-brain barrier and choosing to inject ASOs directly into CSF, the spinal fluid. Of course, ASOs are not the first or the only drug to be administered directly into the spinal fluid. And that form of injection is called intrathecal dosing. Done properly, this procedure is rapid, very safe, and typically to assure that the volume of CSF is not acutely increased. Remember, the CSF is only 150 mils, and you don't want that volume to acutely increase because it causes problems. So typically, what's done is the same amount of CSF is removed that would be the volume of the injection that's about to be done. The most common side effect, there are really very few, of intrathecal injections is headache. And those typically happen more in adults than children. These headaches can hurt quite a bit, but they are self-limited and they resolve on their own. To avoid headaches, out of an abundance of caution, we usually keep n-Lorem patients in the hospital for a little bit after an IT dose. Though IT injections are somewhat cumbersome, the plus is that the ASO are administered directly in CSF, and because CSF clearance is very slow, and so the drug stays in the compartment for a long time, we can dose quarterly. So not so frequently as we do with the systemic injection. And we're working on ASO designs that we hope will support even less frequent dosing. So key point, IT injection allows the administration of drugs, including ASOs, that otherwise are excluded by the blood-brain barrier by poking a hole in the blood-brain barrier and administering the drug directly in CSF. Well, but can't you find a way to outwit the blood-brain barrier? Isn't there research going on to allow drugs better access to the brain? Well, yes. As effective as the blood-brain barrier is, it can certainly be overcome. Any inflammation in the lining of the brain can cause disruption of the blood-brain barrier, and that's called meningitis. Meningitis just means inflammation of the membranes that line the central nervous system, the dura. Any inflammation will lead to increased CSF production, and that can be acutely dangerous. Of course, on occasion, rarely, thankfully, infectious organisms themselves can penetrate the blood-brain barrier. There are really some smart infectious organisms. Once again, that produces a syndrome called meningitis. So meningitis just means inflammation of the lining of the brain and spinal cord. Bacterial or infectious meningitis implies that you have an inflammation that's going on in the lining of the central nervous system that's caused by some infectious organism that managed to get past the blood-brain barrier. There have been programs for decades in major companies, certainly including Ionis and Biogen and Roche and others, their purpose is to see if we can find a safe way to transiently open the blood-brain barrier that would then support, we could give the ASOs systemically, and that would be easier, and it would get right in the central nervous system. And in fact, quite a number of approaches can transiently open the blood-brain barrier. The challenge, and this is really important to hear, has been the same with overcoming other barriers of the body. How do you do that? That is, open these tight junctions, disrupt the blood-brain barrier, get your drug in without allowing other stuff to come in, like toxins and infectious organisms. And that is the core challenge. Not opening the blood-brain barrier, but opening it repeatedly, safely. Again, that just emphasizes one of the first things I told you at the beginning of the podcast series. Drugs are tools to provide what we think of as a therapeutic index. And while many manipulations are possible biologically, very few manipulations are possible in a human being that do that, and safety is a critical concern. So, key point, overcoming the blood-brain barrier repeatedly and safely, despite all the effort for many decades, remains very, very challenging. So, in conclusion, we dose IT for CNS indications because we have to. However, even though the procedure is somewhat invasive, our experience with tens of thousands of patients confirm that IT dosing of ASOs is extremely well tolerated. Though efforts continue to find a way to break through the blood-brain barrier to deliver ASOs, I believe a more practical, far safer way to go is to improve ASOs so they can be dosed much less frequently than quarterly, perhaps annually. Of course, that would make it easier to manage CNS patients. And there, I think progress toward that goal is reasonably encouraging. And we look forward to the day when we can dose as infrequently as annually. So that's why we dose intrathecally and why we're confident that when we dose intrathecally, we can do it safely and repeatedly.
n-Lorem is a nonprofit committed to discovering and providing personalized experimental treatments for free, for life, to patients with genetic diseases that affect 1 to 30 patients worldwide, referred to by n-Lorem as nano-rare. Many of these patients progress and die without ever achieving a diagnosis. This is where n-Lorem comes in. They do the impossible by providing hope, and for those that they can help, free lifetime treatment. For more information about n-Lorem or today's episode, visit n-Lorem.org. Any questions can be sent into podcast@n-Lorem.org. Search n-Lorem on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook to connect with us. Please rate and review the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. This truly helps us climb the charts and allows others to find the show. This podcast is hosted by Dr. Stan Crook. Our videographer is John Magnuson of Mighty One Productions. Our producers are John Magnuson and Kira Deneen of DNA Today. Thank you for listening.
Can you believe it's been 2 years since we started this podcast journey together? We want to hear from you on how to make the Patient Empowerment Program podcast series an even better resource for nano-rare patients. Please consider giving us a few minutes of your time to complete a survey on our podcast. As a thank you, you'll receive a special coupon code to the official n-Lorem Foundation store. You can access this survey by using the link in the description. Your feedback means a lot to us.